Let us know the Bible, Old Testament, with Father Claudio Doglio. The 12 Prophets. Besides the four great prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, in the canon of the ancient scriptures, there is a book called the 12 Prophets. It is not really 12 books, but a single book that gathers 12 prophetic voices. They have often been called minors as well, but only because they have composed shorter books. They are no less important and valuable because of their teaching. If we also consider that the book of Daniel is not really a prophetic book, and in the Jewish tradition it is also placed in another context, we can say that the great books of the prophets are four: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. We are going to consider this book of 12 prophets that contains the intervention of 12 characters. Some are historical men who have lived in a precise context. Others are literary names of scholars that have taken up some themes, and then there was an editor around the 3rd century before Christ who brought all these voices together and gave birth to a single great book. In the order of the canon, the 12 prophets are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. It begins from the oldest to the most recent. The prophet Hosea is a preacher of the 8th century, and contemporary and a little before Isaiah, while Malachi is the last text produced in the late 3rd century, and between Hosea and Malachi 5 centuries go by. These 12 prophets in some way summarize the prophetic history of the people of Israel. To not give a list of names, I will stop at just a few of them and highlight the most important elements. Hosea is the oldest, the first of the list. He belongs to a Levitical group of prophets, sages, popular preachers that we have already met on other occasions and defined them as Deuteronomists. A failed marriage characterized Hosea's story. He lived through a painful experience of marital betrayal. His wife left him, and not only that, but she changed her religion. She left him, who was engaged with the Yahwist religions, and turned to the Canaanite religion, and she prostituted herself in the Canaanite temples where there was practiced this strange reality called sacred prostitution. Hosea interpreted this trauma, the pain of this family betrayal, and interpreted his story as if it were a representation of what happened to God. In a way, this is Hosea's inspiration. He feels like a betrayed husband, but he also thinks that God is in the same condition as him. God has been betrayed by his wife, the people, because they have prostituted themselves. The powerful language of love marks the pages of Hosea. He is the great prophet who created this image of God, God husband of the people, of a God betrayed by the people who prostituted with other gods. And at the same time, Hosea gives voice to a passionate God who does not accept this abandonment and uses all means to recover the wife. Another interesting aspect of Hosea is another shade of family pain. His children's disappointments. We cannot know whether this is part of the prophet's own experience or if it is a poetic reworking. In fact, Hosea presents God like a disappointed father who reminds his child Israel everything that he did for her. He taught her how to walk, he lifted her in his arms, he fed her, attracted her with bonds of kindness, and yet Israel abandoned him, betrayed him. My people are hard to convert, called to look up, no one looks up. So what should I do? Punish them. And yet my heart trembles within me so that I do not fall into my anger because I am God and not man. Hosea speaks of the heart of God, passionate, who intervenes for punishment, but not for destruction. The first word of the 12 prophets is a word of purifying love. Hosea begins to announce possible destruction. In fact, some years later, the Assyrians will destroy Samaria. Hosea preached in the north, in the kingdom of Samaria, where at the same time, Amos was also preaching. A man from the south who moved to the north to rebuke the people for their betrayal at the sanctuary of Bethel, the national center of the cult of the king. In the kingdom of Israel, Amos challenges another aspect. Amos is the prophet of justice. He is the one who rebukes the people for the grave violations of justice. They sold the poor for a pair of sandals. It was a time of social welfare, the 8th century in Samaria, and yet this welfare concealed the exploitation of many poor people. We would say that there had been inflation. The debts had grown disproportionately, and the poor were no longer able to pay them, and they became slaves. They became servants of the few lords who became landowners, and a peasant was worth a pair of sandals. Amos raises his voice to defend justice, to reproach to that wealthy society which considers itself religious, which worships in Bethel, in the house of God, but which in reality exploits the poor, reduces them to slavery, and values them as a pair of sandals. Amos also has harsh words against the people, prophesies against the women, the wives of these landowners. He calls in a hard way the cows of Bashan, fat cows of the plateau of Bashan, ready to boil, and they will throw forks at you. He mocks these landowners who sing lying on their couches, eating their greasy food, and do not care for the ruin of their brothers and sisters. They will end up in exile. As Hosea, also Amos announces the imminent disaster. They speak in the name of God. They are right, not so much because they predict what is going to happen, but mainly because they say what the Lord thinks about the concrete situations of their history. Hosea and Amos are the only two prophets who preached in the north, authors of texts that have been preserved in this collection. All the others come from the south, from the kingdom of Judah, around Jerusalem. The third contemporary is Micah. This prophet also worked in Judea at the end of the 8th century along with Isaiah. Micah was the voice of the poor, the voice of the peasants, the voice of those who had suffered, especially from the Assyrian invasion, the devastation of the countryside, the abuses committed by the soldiers. Micah is the prophet who announces a new leader that will emerge from Bethlehem, a small country town. But from that village, centuries before, came David, a young shepherd that had ascended to the great position of king. Now the monarchy has degenerated, but there will be a new king, a new leader. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, least among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel. Therefore the Lord will give them up until the time when she who is to give birth has born to the Israelites. It is an authentic messianic prophecy and does not say anything precise. The mother of the Messiah is the one who must give birth. God's plan is there. It will be fulfilled in its own time. Hosea, Amos, Micah are contemporaries of Isaiah. We are in the 8th century, the time of the Assyrians. 100 years later, others of these 12 prophets appeared in Jerusalem. They were contemporaries of Jeremiah when the enemy were the Babylonians. Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Nahum are authors less historically characterized. They take up the classical discourses of the prophets who reproach the people. Zephaniah announces the dies irae, the day of wrath. The day is coming when the Lord will raise Jerusalem. But at the same time, he announces that there will be a humble and poor remnant who will seek the Lord. The rest of Israel will seek the Lord. Habakkuk asks the Lord, "How can you not see the injustice that exists?" The Lord tells him that the Babylonians will come to punish this injustice. But how the prophet reacts to punish an injustice, he calls on an even more unjust people, violence that crushes violence. But how is this possible? What is the solution? Habakkuk's last word is a promise from God. There is a time limit. Don't worry. It will be met in due course. It doesn't delay. If you think that it is taking too long, just wait. The decisive word from Habakkuk perspective is, the righteous shall live by his faith. A very important word that St. Paul will take up and will adapt as the great message of salvation by faith in the power of Jesus Christ. Amid these oracle texts, the book of Jonah also appears, which is something special, a strange text. It's a novel, a sapiential tale that speaks of the prophet called Dove. Jonah means dove. The dove is the bird that symbolizes Israel. It is a disobedient prophet. The story of Jonah is the story of Israel. The Lord told Jonah to go to Nineveh and preach. Jonah went precisely the opposite way. He got into a boat. The stormy sea threatened to wreck the ship. And Jonah was thrown into the sea. The Lord commanded the big fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah ended up at the bottom of the sea, and he stayed there for 3 days. The big fish is the chaotic symbol. It is the primordial monster of chaos. Israel Jonas ends up at the bottom of the sea. It is the exile, destruction. Disobedience leads to shipwreck in life. At the bottom of the sea, Jonah realizes that he was wrong and begs the Lord to free him. On the 3rd day, the Lord commands the fish to spit on Jonah on the beach. and the story begins again. It is the post-exile, the rest of Israel. It is the opening to the Gentiles. The Lord says the same thing. Go to Nineveh, the great city. Proclaim outside Israel the salvation of God. And Jonah this time obeys, announces penance to those miserable people of Nineveh who would have said they convert. Those who are far away accept it, and Jonah gets angry. It is sinful Israel that does not accept strangers in God's salvation. It is a sapiential text that serves to show a new universalist openness that Israel struggles to accept. In the post-exile period, at the time of the reconstruction of the temple and the nation, there appears Haggai and Zechariah, are two historical men who in Jerusalem around the year 520 promoted the reconstruction of the temple, because the small rest of that returnees were more concerned about their own house than about the common house, the temple of God. Zechariah has many more images than Haggai's small text. It speaks of the purification of the high priest Joshua. In a vision, he sees him first dressed in dirty clothes, and then, thanks to God's intervention, dressed in the solemn pontifical robes to begin a new cycle. Probably this high priest Joshua is what we call the third Isaiah, the one who inaugurates the new temple and gives hope to the small rest. The last of the 12 prophets is Malachi. It is not a real name. Malak means messenger. Yah is the abbreviation of the proper name of God. It is the messenger of God. It is the last one that closes the series and announces the intervention of the Lord. A day is coming, hot as an oven, and the Lord will enter his temple and purify it. The book of Malachi, and we did the book of the 12 prophets, end up with the announcement of Elijah's return, the old prophet who will open the way to the new Jerusalem, to the new reality. After all, Malachi, the last of the prophets, borders the New Testament. Now I am sending to you Elijah the prophet before the day of the Lord comes, the great and terrible day. He will turn the heart of fathers to their sons and the heart of sons to their fathers. This Elijah, who prepares the way for the Lord, is recognized as John the Baptist, the last, the greatest of all the prophets. And the great day of the Lord is fulfilled in the presence of Jesus Christ, who makes the words of all the prophets true.